Hello, my name is John Davis and I am the moderator and developer of the radio television program called In the Radio Shack. Today I want to start out with one of my favorite books on shortwave radio history. It's called Day of Deceit, The Truth About FDR and Pearl Harbor. It was written by Robert B. Stennett, and it was about the era of life in the United States and the world where shortwave radio and cables were the only means of long-range communications. This book is so interesting to me because back in the day, all the literature and all the congressional hearings said that there was no Japanese communications between Japan and the fleet that was going towards Pearl Harbor. Mr. Stennett in his book had the information that he obtained from the Freedom of Information Act that says that this was not true, that there were indeed, in fact, communications between Japan and the fleet going towards Pearl Harbor, and that there were 129 communications between Nagumo and the people on the various aircraft carriers and other ships. The fact that there was supposed to be radio silence is just a nice story that the federal government told the congressional hearings. The only thing I wish I could have do to improve upon this book would be to have some pictures of the shortwave radio equipment that was used at Pearl Harbor or up in Alaska or the Philippines, where they tracked the Japanese fleet going towards Pearl Harbor. Welcome to episode 2. Episode 1, when we did it, we were in a rush to get it off to YouTube, and so there were some scenes that were inadvertently left out. Those scenes that shows the outside antenna will be at the end of this episode. A lot of my radios are tube type receivers for a very good reason. It's like I have better selectivity than a lot of the newer receivers. But on the other hand, a lot of these receivers are now very old and take more maintenance than they used to 30, 40 years ago. But the nice thing about these receivers is that they are almost indestructible. If you look at the R390A here, it weighs 75 pounds and has 30 tubes. Little things can go wrong with these receivers and you can still operate them. When these receivers were turned out surplus by the United States government, one of the things that they did was take out certain modules that they wanted to keep to repair other receivers that they were keeping. Another thing that they did, they took the carrier level meters and the circuitry with them and cut them out. And so the receiver doesn't quite work right at all the times. You have to have a very large signal to make the signal meters respond. The people that did the hatchet job on these receivers, some of them did it really crudely, I've heard. Some of them, the receivers, the S meters were completely untouched. The R391 I have at the other end of this line, the S meter works perfectly. When you look at the R391s, they were made back in the 1950s, and a lot of these were made back in the 50s and 60s. And so, you know, some of these receivers can be 50 plus, 60 plus years old. I have, as I said, my R390A here, and I have a McKay 5050A receiver down here. Both of them work comparably. If you listen to WWV here on these two signals, these two receivers, the audio is one is just as strong as the other. Earlier tonight, when I was listening to these receivers, both of them were pulling in WWVH in Hawaii at the same time with comparable signals. I am a shortwave radio monitor, which means that I listen to shortwave stations such as the BBC or NHK Japan or the Voice of America. But I also, as a shortwave radio listener, like to hear ham radio stations, which are people who are doing communications that are personal between other amateur radio stations located around the world. And I also like to listen to utility stations. When I get back to the place where I'm telling about some of the stations I've heard this month, I will include a couple utility stations. Ham radio is very interesting because they do some amazing things. When I listen to the BBC from Singapore or I listen to China Radio International, they could be broadcasting with a transmitter using 100,000 watts or 500,000 watts. When I listen to a ham in Indonesia where he's running 800 or 900 watts, he's doing a pretty phenomenal thing. I used to listen to some hams from South America when I spoke Spanish better, and I would listen to stations in Colombia and Ecuador and places like that. And there was one station I got a QSL card from that said that they were using 25 watts to talk around the world in. That was pretty significant to me. There are many ham frequencies that are allowed in the United States, but I only want to talk about the ones that are on shortwave because that's the only ones I have any information on at all. My wife is a ham. She is not that active in it right now, but hopefully in the future she'll become more active. The one organization that provides information on amateur radio is called the American Radio Relay League, and they are a wealth of information. And if anybody who's a shortwave radio listener interested in ham radio, or a shortwave radio, or a ham radio operator who wants to send me a notice of a ham contest or a field day events or whatever, they can send me information 1 month in advance, so I'll have time to work it into the narrative. All DX contests, field day exercises, new amateur shortwave radio transceivers, antennas are all good grist for the mill that I can use in the Radio Shack. As we know, the American Radio Relay League has a bunch of information out there, and a lot of their information is published in book formats. One of the most interesting books that you can use as a ham radio operator or a shortwave radio listener is the Radio Amateur's Handbook. My edition is 1973, and you have a lot newer editions, but they're a lot more expensive. The idea of it is if you want to build your own outside antenna, or if you want to build an antenna switching arrangement or something like that, it's nice to have a book like this around that tells you the ABCs of how to do things. As a shortwave radio listener, I listen to all kinds of stations from all over the world. If you tune to 5,505 kilohertz on the eastern coast of the United States in the night after dark, you have a good possibility of tuning in Shannon Volmet on the upper sideband mode. I listen to them from 303 to 308 with an ID of 303. They had a very good signal, and I heard the information on the particular weather conditions at London Heathrow at 305 UTC. On 94 or 45 kilohertz, I listened to India, the General Overseas Service of All India Radio. I listened at 2053 to 2100 with an ID at 2059 at 9445 kilohertz. I was listening to some programming, but when they went to the news, I became disinterested and tuned out. Another radio station I hear from time to time is Kuwait, and they run radio programs for like the Voice of America and other broadcasters. So on 11,910 kilohertz, I listen to the Voice of America at 1406 to 1413. Since it was in Tibetan, I had to go to the internet to identify the stations on one of the websites that has that information. The signal was very sketchy, and I really even didn't know if I should even log it or not. But I decided because there are some days you hear these stations with a poor signal and you can come back a week later and the signal can be magnificent. China Radio International, I heard it from mainland China on 13,710 kilohertz at 1422 to 1432 with another tentative ID with it from the internet. This was another poor signal. I won't even give you the SINPO rating, just that it took very close listening with earphones to be able to hear anything at all on the signal. I heard this radio station on 326-216. Santa Maria de Galleria, I'd heard Radio Veritas Asia being relayed by them, and that was on 1454 to 1457 UTC on 15,330 kilohertz. They were broadcasting in the Urdu language, and they had some interesting music, completely different than what I'm used to. Turkey, the Voice of Turkey, I heard them on 15,450 kilohertz. from 12:30 to 12:41 with an ID at 12:40. I was really amazed to hear this station because it was in the morning. I usually hear Turkey later in the night, but to hear it in the morning was a nice surprise. The sad thing about it was that the Turkish government had warned the Belgian government that some terrorists had left Turkey and was going to Belgium, and they noted this in their broadcast, and they said that the Belgian government completely ignored them. What good is to have another country's intelligence service give you information if you ignore them? I want to talk a little bit about the upcoming plans in the Radio Shack. Once this program gets better established, we will use programming over commercial TV stations or public radio, depending on where I can find the best advertisements or the grants. I am also looking for someone who can translate this program into Mandarin and Cantonese. Anyone with pictures of military equipment, shortwave radios that were used back in World War II, that have people in them listening, I would like to have copies of those pictures. You can send me information on that via my email address. The next few scenes are those that cover my outside antenna, so I'm cutting off here to show those scenes to you now. Have a really blessed day. Bye. Inside this box is called an un-un. It takes the resistance from this long wire and top antenna and drops it down to someplace between 70 to 50 ohms. It has a 9-to-1 ratio, period. The antenna that you see in back of me is a 687-foot long wire antenna that I call a horizontal array. It is in a north to south, east and west configuration. I use a 9-to-1 un-un instead of a balun to give the best possible signals to my receivers and antenna couplers inside the house. I would like to say that you can send me an email at intheradioshack@hotmail.com. Again, that's intheradioshack@hotmail.com. Thank you.